Survival is not so much about the body, but rather it is about the triumph of the human spirit. During these troubled times, when the world is in the clutches of uncertainty, there is no dearth of opportunity to enrich our knowledge. We, the Department of English, St. Aloysius College Autonomous Mangaluru, welcome you all to the International Conference on the Pandemic and the Future of Capitalism. Let us now invoke the blessings of Lord Almighty before we begin our intellectual pursuit. I deem it a pleasure I deem it a pleasure to welcome our speaker, Professor Sadish Kair, who is a renowned Indian English author and an associate professor in the Department of English, University of Aarhus, Denmark. We extend a warm welcome to you, sir. A leader is someone who demonstrates what's possible. Indeed, our principal, Dr. Pravin Mathis essay, has always been a leader who inspires us to bring out the best in each of us. Hearty welcome to you, Father.
Thank you.
I extend a cordial welcome to Dr. Alvin Desa, the Controller of Examination, Dr. Ratan Mohanta, HOD, Department of English, my colleagues, and the participants of today's session. Welcome you all and hope you have a very enriching experience. Now I request our principal, Dr. Pravin Mathis SJ, to give his opening remarks.
Respected Professor Tabish Kair, our resource person of the day, and my dear members of the faculty, all the scholars and researchers and participants, good afternoon to all of you. I think some it is good morning and some of you maybe it is good evening. So it's an international conference on the pandemic and the future of capitalism. I think this is a very good topic that the Department of English has chosen. I think this is the need of the hour to discuss on the pandemic. This is unprecedented times that we are in. At the same time, we also are facing the times of capitalism. What will happen to the future of capitalism? I think these two go along, and we need to truly discuss on this topic intellectually and come to some kind of an understanding. I would like to bring in all of you into this very important times. This pandemic happens once in maybe history, once in 100 years. And we are facing that difficult times. And we have seen there's a lot of uncertainty. And at the same time, there is fear that is gripped all of us. And during this time, how do we respond to these times? It's very important. It's both a time of challenges. At the same time, this challenge could be taken as an opportunity. It depends on us. How do you take that as an opportunity? Whether we are entering into a new order. Is it calling us for a new order? I think that is very important for us to understand. I think maybe it is calling us for a new order, but are we ready for it? So these are the things I think we need to truly discuss today. I'm sure our resource person, Professor Tabish, would definitely bring his point of view today in front of us, and we will be able to engage ourselves in this fruitful discussion. So I would like to, first of all, congratulate and thank Dr. Ratan Mohanta for organizing such a wonderful international conference on this topic, the pandemic and the future of capitalism, and all the department members of English. I would like to especially thank and congratulate them. Also, I would like to especially thank our resource person, Professor Tabish Kair, for accepting our invitation to be with us and enlighten all of us. So wish you all the best and a warm welcome to all of you to St. Helvetius College on this international webinar. God bless us.
Namaste and a good afternoon to all of you. I deem it my pleasure to share with all of you, our esteemed participants, Tabish Kair's what I would consider the unique, dynamic and multifaceted profile, which for me has an inspirational dimension to it. After dropping out of medical studies, Kair went on to do a BA in History, Sociology and English Literature from Gaya College and obtained his Master's in English from the local Magad University. As a student, he worked as the district reporter for the Patna edition of the Times of India Later, he had to move to Delhi, where he worked as a staff reporter for the Times of India. His seminal creative works include Babu Fictions and Bus Stopped, which was shortlisted for the Encore Award UK. He has another significant work, The Thing About Things, which was shortlisted for many other awards. Besides his accomplishments in works of fiction, he also has co-edited various books and journals, including a casebook of essays on Amitav Ghosh and an anthology of pre-1900 Asian and African travel writing with the foreword by Amitav Ghosh himself. We are indeed privileged to have Tabish Khair as our esteemed resource person. Presently, Tabish Khair is an Indian English author and associate professor in the Department of English, University of Aarhus, Denmark. We are indeed privileged to have Tabish Khair as our esteemed resource person for today's international webinar, and he will be addressing and interacting with us on the topic, the pandemic and the future of capitalism. Now I invite Dr. Tabish Khair to address all of us. Over to you, Dr. Tabish.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope all of you can hear me. Yeah. Otherwise, just send me a message if there's something wrong, and I'll try to see what I can do. First of all, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you to Dr. Mohanta, Professor Praveen, Dr. Severine for the invitation, your kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to go back to India. Usually I go back in person twice a year if I can, definitely once a year. This time I haven't been able to go back at all. So it's a pleasure to meet all of you digitally. Mangalore is a city I've wanted to visit and have never been able to visit, so that's another advantage, though I won't be able to see much of the city. Okay, now I'll launch into my talk. It's not going to be a paper because I've realized that reading out a paper on a screen is even worse than reading out a paper in real life. So what I'm going to do is give you a talk using my sources here and my quotations. I have already posted the references that I will be using. So if you want to look up the books themselves, you have the list further up. I'll try to sum up what I have to say in about 45 minutes or so, so that we have some time for questions or anything else that you might want to ask me. You will have to be prepared for occasional tinkling sounds, which happen when emails hit my computer, and there's nothing I can do to block them. So ignore them. And okay, well, then I'll launch into my talk. Now, first of all, as Professor Praveen pointed out, this pandemic is in some ways very close to what in all religions people used to consider science. Okay, science in the skies, science in the heavens. It's a sign. What do we make of the sign? It's a sign of greater significance than in the past because we have done things to the earth that perhaps would increase the frequency of such pandemics unless we shape up. I might come to that towards the end of my talk if I have time, but if I don't, I just want to point out something that informs my thinking about it, but is not part of this talk, which is the notion of balance, of ecological balance, as well as of various kinds of ecosystems. Now, when we say ecosystem, we think of trees and animals and so on and so forth. In the last 40, 50 years, we have started realizing how bad we have been in these areas. For instance, there was a very interesting experiment in a national park in America some years ago, where they reintroduced wolves, which had become extinct. And by reintroducing wolves, a predatory species, a species we we prefer to kill, unfortunately, they actually restored many other species which had also gone extinct, because wolf formed a major part of the ecological chain. And by disturbing one of the components, we inevitably ended up disturbing many other components. Now, that's what we think that's what we think when we think of ecosystems. But actually, the human body is also an ecosystem. Okay? We tend to forget that. And from the kind of changes that we have been inflicting on the earth for 300 years without really thinking about its consequences, there's a good chance that there will be more virus and other epidemics, and we will be less prepared to cope with them unless we read the signs well. Okay, but anyway, let's move on to the main point: pandemic and the future of the of capitalism. And now, bear in mind that capitalism, as we understood it, whether it was defined by scholars who were positive about it or scholars who were critical about it. Say, we can take up Adam Smith on the one side, often referred to as the father of capitalism, especially his book, Wealth of the Nations, where he doesn't really use the term capitalism. What he actually calls it as more like he uses the term commercial system or commercial society or something like that. But no matter what term he uses, he's talking of capitalism, and that's exactly the definition that Karl Marx, who was more critical of it, writing a bit later, takes up too, despite the difference. According to Adam Smith, capitalism is essentially a relationship between money, which we call capital, money, and labor. Now the question is, what is that kind of relationship? For people who believe in capitalism, the relationship is largely positive. There's some exploitation, perhaps, but money as capital, it is invested in labor, and labor that enables labor to produce. That produce is sold or traded, and the profit is shared out in some ways. People who invest money or capital get some of the profit, and laborers get some of the profit. People who are critical of capitalism, coming from Karl Marx's trajectory, very often, accept that definition. Actually, there's very little you can do with that definition, because that's how it works. So they accept that definition, but they look at the profit as largely exploitative. From Karl Marx's perspective, and of course I'm simplifying all these great thinkers, from Karl Marx's perspective, this profit comes into being because labor is not being given all or most of the wealth that it is creating. There again, Karl Marx actually is drawing on Adam Smith, because Adam Smith and a lot of other thinkers who wrote about what we call capitalism now also pointed out that wealth can only be created by human effort. Anything on its own is not wealth. Human effort is necessary to create wealth, to create anything. So if wealth is created and much of the money goes to not the person who's creating it, but someone else, then people like Karl Marx would say that's happening because this someone else who has put money into it is basically cheating the worker. I'm giving a simpler explanation, but that's what it comes down to. Now, we don't even have to enter all this. You don't have to take a stand on it, whether capitalism is good or bad, okay? Let's just stick to the basic fact that all sides agree on, that capitalism is a relationship of capital and labor, where capital is put into human labor that creates, that produces goods which are traded and sold, and that's how profits accumulate, no matter who gets the profit. Well, having said that, then if you look at certain other recent writers, for instance, a very recent book by Ducrot and Hinckley called Transcending Greedy Money, they point out that there's a kind of logical asymmetry in a money economy. What do they mean by this logical asymmetry? What they mean is this, again, in simple terms. Suppose you make a table, I make shoes, and someone else stitches a shirt. Now, in any economy, one of these goods might be more popular, might make a greater profit because of certain reasons in a certain period or in a certain society. So obviously, if suddenly people are buying shirts more than shoes, it helps to actually make shirts rather than shoes. But this is difficult. To learn to make shirts instead of shoes takes retraining, time, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, in a money economy where all of this is being traded through money, because that's the common medium, money is a medium, of course. There's something else too, we'll come to that. But it's a medium, first of all, because I make a shoe, you make a shirt, someone else makes a table. How do we equate these things? In an exchange economy, you would say, fine, 3 shirts to a table. But that's difficult. The more we produce, the more difficult it gets, as Adam Smith long time back realized. So we need something like money, which is a medium, and that can be anything. In the beginning, it used to have a material source, things that were considered precious or difficult. Cowries very early on, precious metals, then coins containing metals, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we have this money economy now, and we have these different goods. Now, as Hinckley and Ducros point out, because the profit you can get from goods would fluctuate, it makes better sense to traffic in money. Because you need money for all these goods, no matter what happens to the goods. No matter how much you are earning from the shirt you stitch or the shoe you cobble, you will still need money. So if you want to play it safe or smart, you would traffic more and more in money. Now, this is obviously something that was already taking place 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, when societies were turning into heavy mercantile societies, usually under some kind of an overall monarch. Okay, and you can see this in religions. Now, all of you attending what I assume is a Roman Catholic college or was a Roman Catholic college. So many of you would be aware of the one story associated with Jesus that shows him indulging in something that some people might call violence. You know, Jesus is a totally non-violent figure, but one story, and those of you who know the Bible know what I'm referring to. That's when Jesus chases away the money changers from the temple in Jerusalem. Okay. Now, what were these money changers? They were changing different kinds of coins that came from different kingdoms, empires. So you came from a certain kingdom with a set of coins, but you wanted to spend it in another kingdom where another set of coins were being used. These money changers would change it, and in the process, they would charge some kind of fee, some kind of interest. Okay. From there, you move on to a very strong critique in all religions, very strong in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but also quite as strong in certain branches of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, though we tend to forget that, especially in the Sutra period, what is called the Sutra period, 7th to 7th century to 2nd century BC in India, where there were lots of laws prohibiting usury. Okay. Now, usury and interest, they are not the same thing. Okay. Very often, usury is defined as exorbitant interest. Okay. In some societies, they're considered similar. Very many Christian and Islamic traditions in particular equate interest with usury. Many other traditions differentiate between them. Okay. Many Christian and Islamic traditions also differentiate between them. Okay, so but that again is a long historical issue. But the point I'm trying to raise is that around 2,000 years, a lot of religions realized that there's something wrong with people using money to make money. it had to be at least controlled, if not stopped. This is the root of capitalism. Historically, capitalism is traced to the 17th or 18th century. That's true. That's where industrial capitalism comes into being, production increases, captive markets are created, universal markets are created. That's all true. But the logic of capitalism goes back to interest, to making money from money, not necessarily human wealth. Now, until recently, this was not really entirely possible, okay? Because money still had to be invested in human labor. Okay? That is Karl Marx's big problem with capitalism. He believes that capitalism is a revolutionary system. He believes that the bourgeois are a revolutionary class. But he says now all that has stopped, because these classes have made enough money by exploiting people or looting people. And now they're using money to basically maintain their status quo, maintain the system. And that's why the bourgeois, for Marx, ends up from being a revolutionary class to a reactionary class and has to be pushed back, rightly or wrongly. That's what he says. Okay. Now, money or capital, it's become capital now, because you can put in money into something and extract more money without actually having to do any work yourself. But this money or this capital is still invested in human labor, also according to Karl Marx. His problem is, oh, these laborers are being exploited. These workers are not being paid what they should be paid. They are being looted by the capitalists. He uses the image of the vampire. He says, capital is like a vampire. It sucks the lifeblood of the worker. And the more it sucks, the more it lives. So that's an image that Karl Marx uses. Okay. So let's stop here now, and let's look at all of this again with reference to a very interesting historical event, which many of you might not have heard of. It is about a slave ship called Slave Ship Zong. I discuss it in my New Xenophobia, but a more detailed description is there in Anne Bockholm's Spectres of the Atlantic. I will give you a short paraphrase from my New Xenophobia. The Zong was a slave ship that was actually contracted in Africa by a group of merchants who were in England. They had never been to Africa. And they had actually a ship that was supposed to take slaves along the triangle to the New World, Americas, and sell them. That was, of course, big business in the 18th century, and this was around 1780. The ship they had bought or captured, or bought and captured, too many slaves. So they needed another ship. So they bought an old ship there. They made the doctor of this ship, the pilot of this new ship that they had bought, called it the Zong, and filled it with the rest of the slaves. And then a bit after the first ship, this ship also set out for the Americas. The Zong was a ship bought in Africa by the captain of another ship and chartered and sent to Africa by some merchants in Liverpool, then a major center of the triangular slave trade. The captain had appointed his ship's doctor, Luke Collingwood, as the new captain of the Zong, which set sail with its cargo of 440 slaves from Africa on 6 September 1781. The slaves were bought, as was the custom, on credit and paid for with promissory notes to be redeemed after a period of time on their sale in another continent. And hence, they were undergirded by a completely new system, a a totally capitalist system or capitalized system, the system of insurance. Okay? No money, promissory notes, based on sale, but the slaves are insured. If something happens to them, the people who have invested in the slave in Liverpool would get money from insurance. Okay. Now, what actually happened was that slave ship Zong, when it reached its destination, just before it reached its destination, experienced a lot of bad weather. The slaves started falling ill. Some of them started dying. And there was a lull, there was a calm when the ship got stuck. So what the captain decided to do was to throw some of the ailing slaves, the sick slaves, overboard. When they did it, one or two of them swam back and climbed back on the boat. So after that, they were shackled and thrown back into the water. The captain said that they were running out of water, so these people would have died in a few days anyway. It turned out that this was not true. Around the time they started throwing the slaves overboard, there had been rainfall, and the sailors had collected rainwater in vessels, and there was enough water for them to actually reach the land, which was now in sight. Or which was now, like, they knew that they were going to reach it in a day or two. But the captain still ordered these slaves who were ill to be thrown overboard. Now, why do you think that happened? That became a big issue back in England. It didn't become a big issue because these poor human beings were murdered, brutally murdered, by being thrown into the sea. It became an issue because the insurance company decided not to pay. The insurance company claimed that the only reason the captain threw these slaves overboard was that they were weak, thin, emaciated. They had been starving for days. So if they had been taken onto land and sold, they would have fetched much less money than what they were insured for. Now, this is an interesting story, a very sad story, and a very interesting story, because this indicates the logic of capital. Okay. It's interesting, isn't it? You would think that something would have value while it existed. But here we're in a system where it has more value when it is destroyed, when it doesn't exist. Even a human being has more value when it doesn't exist. Something's very wrong. If money is a medium, and that's all it is, then this shouldn't be happening. Of course, money is also a social relation, as Viviana Deliza points out. Being a medium, it's a social relation. It connects us to each other. It establishes hierarchies. So that is also there. But why is this happening? Okay. Now, if that was the situation in the past, look at what exists today. First of all, you'll realize that the gold standard, you probably know that the gold standard was largely abundant everywhere in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. Largely, those are decades that we identify as the decades when neoliberalism started. Now, there are many ways people define neoliberalism, but the one common factor about neoliberalism is the fact that money loses its body. Okay. Money becomes even more immaterial. Okay. It had already become immaterial. Okay. Gold coins, for instance, were not necessarily worth what they were supposed to be worth. The gold they contained was much less than what they were supposed to be worth. So in that sense, it was not gold that was being sold. It was authority. It was a system. And then, of course, we had moved to paper money. Paper money is worth nothing. It's just paper. It's just a system. It's an authority. It's a kind of balance sheet, national balance sheets, international balance sheets. That's what gives it value. With neoliberalism, this paper money, which was actually kept against some stock of gold by the Reserve Bank, the National Reserve Bank, became free floating. The gold was no longer kept in reserve. This is quite interesting. Okay? So what is this money now? Okay. It starts happening in 1970s. We'll come back to this. I'll read out just a couple of other things that happened around the same time. I'm reading out from my New Xenophobia, but I'm quoting Samir Amin, an economist. Goods and services transactions of the world GDP represented 3% of the monetary and financial transactions conducted in the year 2002. Transactions concerning international trade amounted to hardly 2% of the foreign exchange transactions. Settlements of purchase and sale of shares and bonds in organized markets, operations considered as being constituents by excellence to capital markets, amounted to only 3.4% of all monetary settlements. It is transactions in hedging products designed to cover the operator's risks, which have literally exploded. Think of insurance, think of hedging products that transactors' risk. Okay. The ratio between hedging operations and production and international trading, or the ratio between hedging operations on the one side and production and international trading on the other, was 28:1 in 2002, a disproportion that has been constantly growing for about the last 20 years and which has never been witnessed in the entire history of capitalism. Or in other words, you can say that around the year 2000, 1.9 around the year 2000, $1.9 trillion exchanged hands, mostly as numbers, every day on the global markets, financial transactions, at least $1.9 trillion. And this was 50 times greater than the total value of all goods and services traded globally in the year. Now, this is a weird system. We are still talking of capitalism. But is it really capitalism? Yes, it has grown out of capitalism. Maybe it is capitalism. But if capitalism was a kind of relationship, positive or negative, beneficiary or exploitative, I'm not going to get into that. A relationship between capital, money capital, and worker. Okay. Then suddenly, this capital has become freer and freer and freer. It's not measured in anything that exists, has a body. It's become paper. The gold that was kept to buttress the paper has been sold. The paper itself is turning into numbers, digital money, so on and so forth. And of course, this is all happening, this has all been happening since the 1980s, and it's accelerating more and more, more and more. Okay. What people do on Wall Street is not really look at how an industry is doing. They basically do financial transactions simply on the basis of numbers. It has nothing to do with production, with profit, and so on and so forth. That's what a lot of people who are making money are doing, even though we are still thinking in terms of classical capitalism, investing, in production, investing in worker, or if you're leftist, exploiting the worker, okay? But actually, most of these people do not really need the worker as much as Karl Marx rightly thought that capital needed the worker. Now, one indication of that is the pandemic. What's happened in the pandemic? Think of America. America is a good example. There are countries that try to, because of course, I'm not the only one who's aware of this, okay? A lot of people are aware of it. People in power are also aware of it, some of it. They won't talk about it in this critical manner, but it's not as if they're not aware of it. Some people, a lot of people are still running on past ideologies. They think that neoliberalism is the only way out and so on and so forth. And I'm not talking of those people. I'm talking of intelligent people who look at facts. And they are aware of these things too. Okay, so some of them try to rectify some of the issues. In countries like Germany or Denmark, where they're the kind of social welfare state, even though capitalism is still the dominant system, they try to ensure that workers are not left out in the cold altogether. However, countries like America, especially today, do not belong to that category. At the moment, America has been run by people who believe very strongly in capitalism. Sometimes they talk as if it's still classical capitalism. And of course, a lot of it is. Some people would need goods, some people would have work, some people would invest in production, people need clothes, people need luxury goods and so on and so forth. That would be there, it will never disappear. But they don't look at the fact that a lot of money that people are making is not coming from there, it's coming just from moving numbers around, okay? And you can see how that has unfolded in USA. Over the last few months of the pandemic, 40 million Americans have become unemployed. Now, you would imagine that if Americans become unemployed, people who make money off those Americans would also make less money. Unemployed people are not just people who have been thrown out of work because less has been produced. They're also consumers who have less money to invest, less money to buy things. So you would think that if 40 million Americans become unemployed over, say, 3 or 4 months, then rich Americans, very rich Americans, would lose money. But that's not what has happened. The top billionaires have seen their fortunes increase by $500 billion over the same period, the top American billionaires. $500 billion against 40 million unemployed. That indicates what I'm trying to suggest, that money can be made without being invested in production, without being rooted through the worker. I'm not saying that workers do not exist. I'm not saying that production doesn't exist. What I'm saying is that for the first time, there's a large sum of money to be made without being rooted in production or through workers. This is also happening in Germany or Denmark. It's under control. These are, as I said, welfare countries, and they control certain things a bit more. But of course, all the relief packages that have been issued have mostly helped big businesses. And the bigger you are, the more likely you are to be helped. That's happened in an obvious way in America. It's happened in a less obvious way in many other countries, but that's how it has happened. The small businesses, new startups, they are in trouble. Big businesses, big corporations, they are being helped with money, okay? Relief packages, okay? Some of it is going to the poor too, but much of it is going to the very rich, okay? In different ways, okay? Also in terms of investment, okay? It's also something that's been happening in India, though I won't say too much about India. But of course, you would have had the good news 3 or 4 days back or 1 week back that Mukesh Ambani has become richer than any European. Good news. We have Mukesh Ambani as the 4th richest man in the world. He's richer than any European. There are only 3 other people who are richer than him, and they're not European. Oh, we have beaten the old colonial countries. Well, in 2020, Mukesh Ambani saw his wealth increase by 22 billion US dollars. That's a lot of money during a pandemic. That's a lot of money during a period when Indian workers have been, at times, starving. So again, it's not just something that's happening in USA or in India or in China. China, again, is more like a social welfare country, so it's also controlling things a bit. But of course, it's happening in China too, okay? So this is where we stand now. We have entered a phase where large numbers of human beings are being made redundant. The word redundant is used sometimes in industries and corporations. You're redundant. You have to retrain. Okay? But from the perspective of neoliberal capital, a large number of human beings are permanently redundant. That might be the reason why politicians have not been too worried about untrained or semi-trained workers, or even sometimes highly trained workers like nurses and doctors dying. That is not where money as capital, neoliberal capital, resides. That is somewhere else. And that money is still being made. That money is still reaching the politicians who enable corporations and tycoons to make that money. That is the situation we are in. Now, what the situation means is that with something like this pandemic, we stand on a show. We can let this continue, and most likely my theory is that it will continue because there is no organized resistance, not even any real awareness of what's happening. It's very difficult to be aware of this because we are talking of numbers, of figures, which are far beyond the experience of ordinary people, even ordinary people like you and me who come from privileged backgrounds or have good education. We cannot really deal with these things. Those people who deal with them are very often so deeply enmeshed in the system. Their profits and their advantages depend on the system, that they're unlikely to do anything to change it. Okay, so we are in that system where capital does not need workers anymore. Poor Adam Smith, poor Karl Marx, and poor leftists even today. And I personally read a lot of leftist philosophy, and I would consider myself a kind of leftist, but I would still say poor leftists because they're still talking of capitalism as if it is what it was, but it's not. We have to deal with something at a completely different level. Now, to go back to the virus now, how is this going to affect the pandemic and the virus? Obvious ways you can see there have been needless deaths. Death could have been prevented. People could have been saved. In England, in the UK, in the early weeks of the virus going through the roof there were even politicians who suggested that, well, all we can do is let some people die. Herd immunity was suggested. The people who were supposed to be allowed to die were all largely non-productive people, old people, retired people. And of course, people who the system felt could be replaced. Many of these people could have been saved with just some proper scientific steps, some preventional steps, some equipments, some PPEs, which could have been made available. It was not difficult, it was not impossible. Bear in mind that we accused China of taking almost 2 to 3 weeks to really find out what was happening. Problem, okay. But what was happening was new in China. By the time it came to places like UK and elsewhere, it had been there for 2-3 months, and we still did not prepare. Okay, that's a serious problem, and not enough people are talking about it. Okay. Now, along with that, the other thing that's going to happen, now we are moving into the future. First of all, I think this neoliberal system is going to continue unopposed. I would say that the virus crisis, the pandemic, has been used to buttress the system, because the system was going through a financial crisis. It wasn't just in India, where the market had not been doing very well. It was everywhere in the world. All the markets were not doing as well as they were supposed to do. Trump was boasting about employment figures, but those employment figures had shot up because workers were being paid very little. Many people were doing 2 or 3 jobs to get what they needed to exist. And because salaries and other things were so low, more people were being employed by certain industries. In general, the economy was not doing very well anywhere in the world. Then along comes this very convenient virus. Now it's a real threat. I'm not running down the virus. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy. What I'm saying is this is a real threat, but it is being used in certain ways. And the ways in which it is being used financially is very similar to what happened in 2008, the financial crisis, the crash. Money pumped into banks and corporations. Oh, we have to make sure these don't collapse. Otherwise, the country will suffer. Every country did it. Exactly the same thing. Relief packages sent to the richest of the rich, the corporations, the tycoons. Where does this money come from? These are very often, almost always, national governments pumping money in that direction, right to the top. Where does that money come from? It comes from you and me. How do they find that money? They find that money by cutting things that we need. In places like Denmark or Germany, it might be public welfare, maybe fewer buses, maybe fewer trains. As I said, they keep certain things in control, so it won't go that far. In some other places, it would be much more. Maybe the entire postal service, as might happen in the US. Trump is very anxious to defund the postal service and privatize it. Entire industries, large industries, public sector industries, which will be sold out to private investors. The general policy, as Noam Chomsky has pointed out in a number of books, the general neoliberal policy is exactly this. Basically, you defund public sectors so they do not function as well as they could. And then when people get very fed up of them not functioning well, you sell them off to private investors. So I think that is going to happen in a big way. Another thing that's going to happen when the pandemic subsides in about a year, 2 years, another thing that is going to happen is that there will be a push to produce more, work more, exploit more. There will be more environmental devastation. There would be more rash industrial and other ventures. There will be less of an attempt to come up with a system that is sustainable. The focus will be on profits, GDPs, and so on and so forth, share markets. So at the end of this pandemic, we might end up in a situation that would be very similar to what existed before it came into being, and perhaps even worse. That is the problem, and that is the problem that we will have to face, because what is happening is going to impact on you and me, and more on you, the younger people there, than on me. I have another 20 years here. You have much more. My children have much more. And in order to understand that, again, you have to look at how ecosystems work. We cannot just live like locusts on this planet. All religions at their best have pointed this out. The need to take care of the world. The idea that we can leave this world and go off is bad science fiction. Okay? There is no guarantee we can go anywhere. But even if there was, it would be bad science fiction, because what that idea suggests is that certain things are expendable. So if you need money, you need someone's money, you shoot the person, take the money. That's exactly the same kind of logic. That is not what we can have. It's not sustainable, it's not moral, but more than it's not moral, it's not sustainable. Now, if you think of viruses, I would end up by just pointing this out. I know I have spoken for about, I lost track, but I think I started around 9:30. So I've spoken for about 45 minutes or almost 1 hour. Am I right? Dr. Mohanta, can you just tell me if but then I'll just sum up in 2 or 3 minutes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. About 45 minutes you have taken.
Okay. So I'll just sum up in 2 or 3 minutes. Okay.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So now one interesting thing to point out about the pandemic is to think of it in biological terms. Right now, I had been talking about socioeconomic and some historical matters, but think of it in biological terms. So think of how many cells the human body contains. I don't know whether any of you come from biology, but if you do, you would know that the human body contains around 30 trillion human cells. Okay? 30 trillion per body, roughly. How many microbes does the human body contain? Actually, 39 trillion. There are more microbes in us than human cells. How many viruses do we contain? Probably much more. Okay? And all these things are not just useless. Some of them are, just as part of our DNA is probably useless and it's called junk DNA. Probably not all of it. There's more and more indication that even that is useful. Okay, all of this, it is not useless. It's a balance. The human body is also an ecosystem. When things go wrong because of our lifestyles, because of what we are doing to the world, then more problems are going to come up. I'm not saying that problems can be solved if we just live this perfect life. I don't believe in that. Certain things happen, certain diseases happen, certain viruses are deadly, and they will never disappear. But when pandemics happen, when the number of pandemics increases, there's something wrong with our ecosystems. And that's both the larger ecosystem and the smaller ecosystem, which is the human body. Okay? The one big problem I think human beings have is that they do not realize that they are not just a unit. They're part of a large system, not just externally, but internally. We are part of many cells working together, cells using microbes using viruses, and so on and so forth. Okay, the way to go about it is not to take a gun and put a silver bullet through something. We're not out here to kill werewolves or drive a stake through the heart of a vampire. Sometimes that might be necessary, okay? But most of the time, what it needs is balance and care. Pay attention to what exists around you. Pay attention to yourself. And that is exactly what neoliberalism is not allowing us to do. Neoliberalism says the only thing that matters is money, capital. And that capital has nothing to do, or very little to do, with you out there. That capital floats around on its own. It can live, even if many of us do not exist. That, I think, is the problem. And the future of capitalism will depend on that. Whether capitalism will be able to address this problem, which from my perspective seems unlikely, whether we will be able to change the system to something else, which from my perspective also seems unlikely, or whether we'll continue like this so that something much worse will happen, and then perhaps we'll learn a lesson. Thank you. Okay, there are questions.
So, Dr. Tabish, thank you very much for that wonderful discussion that you brought in to this topic of capitalism and the pandemic, touching upon both the issues of the pandemic and capital, and to suggest what could be the future in the way you put it. It's very interesting that things might go on like this. The possibility, of course, and that things might change, looking very bleak. I think we are in fact looking at a much bleaker world in the future. there is that kind of anxiety and fear that has actually got into our minds, and for enlightening us with all your ideas on how the entire process has gone about, and we are here today. Thank you very much for bringing those ideas to us and sharing with all our participants. And I think now we can take some questions. If you have questions in your chat box, we
Yeah,
can.
I can see some questions, of course. Oh, no, there's so many questions. They're all disappearing. Okay. Okay. So do you want me to just take some questions from the chat box and answer them?
Yeah, that would be fine.
Okay. Otherwise, I mean, you are the host, so you can also guide me. I'm completely your guest.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you can take the questions from the chat box.
Yeah,
and
I
then
mean, the question I was reading when you asked me about questions was something about democratic socialism. Can it serve as a feasible structure for the post-pandemic governments across the world? And I think that's a very good question. I do think that democratic socialism as a system has hardly ever existed. Okay, it has existed more in its absence, lip service, and so on and so forth. So I would say that that's one experiment that has not been tried. Really democratic socialism. I'm not talking of, my leftist friends would be unhappy, I'm not talking of communism. I'm talking of democratic socialism, which has been kind of usurped from both sides. From capitalism, you have these welfare states, which are basically capitalist states that operate a bit like rich families do, in the sense that if you're a member of the family, you get enough to live on, and once in a while we give a bit of charity to poor people outside our gates. But we are not going to change the system. We're not going to lose our privileges. Okay, that's how capitalist social welfare states largely function. So that's one side. Then you of course have extreme capitalism where everything is dismissed, and then we had certain communist experiments which as we can see have ended up becoming versions of a state capitalism. Okay, so this entire idea of democratic socialism, which would mean the existence of civil society, of transparent and accountable democratic structures, and of socialist accountability, which would imply both the possibility to grow as you want and to have the minimum that every person needs. That has not really been tried completely. So I would say, yes, sure. Okay, I'll move on to another question. Oh, Shoykert, MPhil, that's a very difficult question. You're talking about the biological other, the virus, and I'm not sure I would call the virus a biological other, but I know where you're heading, and I thought it's a very interesting question. But it's a very complex question. So what I would suggest is, you said you had contacted me by mail. I would suggest just send me an email and we can have a chat about this. Okay? If I start going into it here, it will probably take half an hour. But it's a very interesting question. I'm afraid the next question is spillover. I haven't read it. So I've heard of it, but I haven't read it. Why were there no measures taken to prevent a pandemic from emerging and spreading? Well, I think the reason actually is neoliberal capitalism. Governments hoped that it would go away. Okay? Some pandemics do go away. Okay, they hope. China hoped too. China hoped. I'm very sure China could have done things maybe 1 week earlier. I'm not one of those people who blames everything on China, but it could have done things 1 week earlier. All other countries in Europe and America could have done things 2 months earlier. Okay, so but they were all hoping. They were hoping this will go away, and of course it didn't. Some viruses go away. This one didn't, and it was due. As I mean, virologists say that this is actually not the pandemic they were expecting. They are actually expecting a flu pandemic, which they think is going to come, because the flu virus mutates very quickly, and they feel that a big flu pandemic is due. So let's see. Are we prepared for that?
Okay. Yes, Dr. Tabish, here is one question I want to bring to you. This is from one of my students, Naveen, who asks, to paraphrase a passing comment from the author John Green, the American dream is to be the born rich and stay rich. This greed can lead to a devastating reality, which you have already outlined so far. How does one go about reconciling the potential of upward class mobility with capitalist greed?
It's a very difficult question and a very difficult situation. Um, the American dream, as you put it, and John Green, it's a good a good author to quote. The American dream is to be born rich and stay rich, or actually, I mean, that is more like the version of American dream that exists now. Initially, the American dream was to just become rich. America was supposed to be this place where everyone could become rich. That was the great myth on which America was founded. Now, what was left out of that myth was the fact that we were basically talking of white people. And we were not talking of what was happening to American Indians, who were definitely not getting rich. We were not talking of what was happening to Africans who were brought in as slaves, who were definitely not getting rich. We were not talking of the fact that these large stretches of natural areas, rich natural areas, had been basically occupied by white settlers, claimed by white settlers. So for some time, yes, some of these white settlers were affluent people from Europe. Some were actually quite poor people from Europe. And they went to America with this dream, and some of them did become rich because that was just open space for them. You could go to many of the states and claim land if you're white. You could just mark out land and that land would be yours. So that is actually at the root of the American myth. Then the American myth got structured. The American dream got structured. And then, of course, you were born rich and you stay rich. That is what the status is. The status quo is right now. So what I'm trying to say is that there has always been upward mobility at the cost of many who are below those classes. It's nothing new. It's been there in the past. It's there today. And socialism, and that connects to the other question. So socialism is basically a way to monitor that. It's not a way to say you cannot move up. It's a way to say that you cannot necessarily move up at the cost of these elements or these people. It's a way to say that people do have certain human rights, some basic rights, and they cannot be tinkered with. Okay, so in that sense, I would say that there's no way to deal with it if we believe in capitalism as a system that is inevitable and perfect, or the best of all systems. The only way is to actually think of something that would combine elements from what we call capitalism, and those elements, I would say, relate to the institution of money as a medium. Bear in mind that I mentioned slave ships long. Slavery has been a long tradition. Even Karl Marx was aware of that in different ways. Now, all societies have had slavery in different ways. India too, even though we say that we haven't had slavery, but the caste structure very often worked as a kind of slavery. And all societies have had slavery in different ways. What happened with the slave ship long was something different, because slaves were turned into goods and commodities. In all societies before that, slaves had certain rights. They could, for instance, have children. They could, for instance, have property. They could, for instance, end up becoming generals and sometimes even kings, which they did become in India and in Egypt and some other places. And in ancient Greece, for that matter, generals. But why did slavery exist? Because the body itself was wealth. Okay, the body was the source of wealth. Okay, and once money comes in, actually it frees the body to some extent. Okay, it becomes the medium, and the body need not be enslaved. Okay, you can make money without enslaving the body. Actually, if the body is free, as some capitalists would say, it is better, because a free body would consume more, would spend more. Okay, so again, I mean, that relationship is there. So money cannot be dismissed, as I think late 19th century communists very often did. Money is a useful instrument, but how can it be controlled? How can it be used so that it aids us human beings and the earth? That's the question that we need to ask, not just about money, but about so many other things. Nuclear power, for instance. Okay, it's useful, but are we going to use it to make nuclear bombs and bomb each other? That's up to us, and we can decide. I don't think it's idealism. It's a necessary matter that we are told is idealism, because people in power want us to think that it cannot be done. If we're thinking along those lines, then we're just being unpractical. We need to keep thinking the way they want to think us, the way they want us to think. So, okay, that's about it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's a very good question by KP Modi. Ambani emerges as the richest, thousands are going down. Is it good for your nation's interest? A lot will depend on how you define the nation, how you define society. So, and you can answer it yourself. Also, you can guess where I would stand there. If India becomes the ruler of the world like USA, well, USA is not really the ruler of the world. It just has a dominant position. And if India ends up being like that along the current patterns, then it will probably end up being like USA. Except that I don't believe that places like India can ever become something like that. For a very simple reason, these European countries and America made money and came into capitalism in a period when their population was not very high, and there were vast spaces for them to populate and colonize. We don't have that option. The only way we can do that is actually to go and invade America and kill off most Americans, which I'm very sure you would not want to suggest. So I think the idea that we, whether it's America, whether it's India, whether it's China, will become America is totally misleading. We don't have the resources to become America. If Indians start using as much energy as America does, then I don't think there will be any energy left in the world. So those are issues we have to think about. Okay, there are lots of other questions, but I don't know how much time you have.
Yeah, so I'll take up just two questions.
Sure.
From this one. I'll just take up two questions from here. What are the implications of the pandemic for migrant communities and refugees? Is the nomination of Kamala Harris symptomatic of an emergent brand of identity politics that is moving towards a more inclusive discourse? Has systemic and internal racism become more ostensible due to the pandemic?
Good question. If you actually come up with answers to all three questions, you will have a very good paper. So if you're a scholar, maybe you should start working on that. Well, I think migrant communities, refugees, untrained workers, these are all susceptible communities. That's also something I had suggested in xenophobia a long time before the pandemic. I had suggested that certain xenophobic tendencies tend to accrete to these marginalized communities who were seen as not necessary for the creation of wealth in neoliberal capitalism. So obviously the pandemic is going to hurt these communities much more. I mean, there's no doubt about that. The nomination of Kamala Harris, let's see. I mean, I haven't followed Kamala Harris that closely, but I was impressed. I mean, I'm not a Biden fan, but I'm not a Biden. I don't dismiss Biden too. I think he's a fairly decent mainstream politician, and after what we have been seeing in the last few years, fairly decent mainstream politicians are quite okay with me. So, but what impressed me was that Kamala Harris had focused on Biden, almost entirely on Biden in the preliminaries, and she had really criticized him because she had not launched into Bernie and the others. She had launched into Biden. So what impresses me is that this is someone who actually takes a harsh critic and makes her his possible second in command. That I find something that is admirable. I can think of many leaders in the world who would never do this. Actually, I can think of most leaders in the world who would never do this, who would only employ people who agree with them and who are very polite to them. So in that sense, it is good. Whether it would lead to a more inclusive discourse or not, well, the very fact that a woman is coming in is good, but of course, there's no guarantee that anything would happen. We'll have to wait and see. I did say something long time back when Obama came to power after the first year. So, and I think it was great Obama came to power because Obama set an example. He first of all, he was a very decent leader, very decent person, a learned person, and he set an example for colored children in America. So it was a very good thing he came to power. There's no doubt about it. But along with that, in his first term, I had said that Obama is unlikely to make any major change in America, simply because, unfortunately, he is seen as black. Being black, he has to try and keep everyone happy, not appear to be too progressive, not appear to disturb decent white people. So if we are going to have progressive change in America at the moment, because America is not prepared for anything else, we actually need a progressive white president, probably supported by progressive colored and female groups behind him. If that happens with Biden, I think there will be change, but let's see.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. And one last question, which looks quite interesting. I think we can take that one last question and end there.
Sure.
So this is the question. As Frederick Jameson, in his essay on postmodernism or the cultural logic of late capitalism, there he explains three phases of capitalism: market capitalism, monopoly capitalism, and late capitalism. Okay, so what is, in your view, viewpoint of post-pandemic situation of capitalism? Is there any new form of capitalism that can emerge from this?
Yeah, sure. Well, I read Frederick Jameson's book when I was doing my PhD. So, I mean, but I recall some of it. And my impression is that what he calls late capitalism is very close to what I call neoliberal capitalism. Okay? I mean, there might be some minor differences, but by and large, I don't think there's any major difference there, because he also talks of certain similar trajectories. Of course, the book itself, I think, was published in the 1990s or so. It was a very early period, but he can see that trajectory. A lot of it hasn't happened. So I think if he were going to write in it in, say, 2010, he would probably end up stressing some of the things that I have stressed. And the reason I don't call it late capitalism is just this, because I'm probably the only person who's asked this question. If someone has, send me an email, let me know, I'll check the person. I'm the only person who's asked whether neoliberalism is actually capitalism, whether we can call it capitalism. And in that sense, whether what Frederick Jameson calls late capitalism should be called late capitalism, because the basic definition of what capitalism is has changed. It's not capital invested in labor creating goods and profit. It is something else. I mean, that is happening, but that's not as central as it was. And in that sense, perhaps we need to think about whether it's not whether we are actually going to survive capitalism or whether capitalism is going to survive, but whether actually capitalism has survived, whether we have actually moved into something that has grown out of capitalism and is getting out of hand. And maybe in the future, some capitalists will have to think about it. How do they want to make their money? Playing around with numbers, or producing goods and hiring people? I'm exaggerating a bit, but not too much.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so thank you very much, Dr. Tabish, for that wonderful session we had, and hope we'll meet you again sometime when you come here to India next.
Definitely.
You can perhaps drop in. Yeah, you can perhaps drop in here and visit us. We have a wonderful place here in Mangalore. It's a
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Just
So
just one thing. I can see there were lots of questions, people asking me whether they could contact me. So in that case, anyone who wants my university email, I think it's engtk@cc.au.dk.
okay.
I mean, the students are most welcome to contact me. I mean, I love to hear from students who are engaged with ideas.
Yeah.
Definitely.
That's really nice. Yes, good. Thank you, sir.
Thank
So
you.
thank you very much for that wonderful on
Thank you.
behalf
Take,
of
take
all of us.
care. Yeah, take
Yeah,
care and
yeah,
stay
yeah.
safe, all of you.
Yeah. Thank you. So, on behalf of all the faculty here and on behalf of the management and staff of the college, I wish to extend very warm greetings and express my gratitude to you for having accepted our invitation to be here with us. Thank you, Dr. Tabish. Yes.